Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So I'm going to warn you right off the bat that today's video is probably going to be much more of a rambling rant than anything else. So for the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about the macro picture about what exactly is wrong with our culture. But today I'm going to shrink that view down to the micro view of what exactly is wrong with our culture, why there is a culture war going on, why this struggle has to exist to begin with. And I started to think along these lines because I ran across an interview which some of you may have seen from the BBC having to do with Veterans Day, wherein you had this veteran of World War II being interviewed, and he basically said to the interviewers who were not able to process this information that he looks around at the country that he fought for today in its present condition and considers that next to the row on row of crosses of the sacrifice of him and his friends, and he says it was not worth it. And when they asked him to clarify a little more, he basically said that the freedom and liberty that he was fighting for in the 1940s is actually in a worse condition right now. And this is not the first interview that is with a World War II vet where they say this kind of thing. There's another one from Great Britain from a couple of years ago. There's one from a couple of years ago from the US. He was a Marine, basically saying the same thing. If we look at the countries around us today that we live in, the conflict of World War II and its sacrifice simply was not worth it. And if you're wondering why I have Captain America in the background, it's because on my Wednesday live stream, I talked about this video as concerns Captain America, because you have these writers of Captain America today saying, oh, Captain America would be a quote-unquote progressive and on our side. No, he wouldn't. But anyway, in starting to think about this and other things that I've run across in the last week, a very simple notion came to me, a notion which I think is self-evident in a logical way. That is to say, logical self-evident means that if you know the definition of the words correctly that make up the statements, the conclusion off of that statement is automatically clear to you. And yes, I'm going to play a little fast and loose with that, but here are a few statements that I think you would agree with me on. Number one, the more precious a thing is to us, the more valuable it is to us, and by extension, the more expensive it is. And number two, one of the things we find as both individuals and as a culture to be the most valuable to us right now is our freedom. So the natural conclusion should be the seemingly paradoxical statement that freedom is not free. Now, this is a statement which I think most of us, upon hearing it, would consider to be true, but most people simply do not consider it. It's the simple fact that my freedom and your freedom and our freedom as a culture came at a great price. And not only came at a great price, but we continually have to pay that price. Even now, today, in every moment, if we wish to still possess that freedom. Now, in talking about this in terms of America, I would say that the Founding Fathers laid out basically two different paths in order to maintain this freedom. One would be violent conflict in order to defend yourself against tyranny. The other was simple moral virtue, taught, passed down from parents to children in a family. They expected that the country would be made up of families wherein moral virtue would be passed down from one generation to the next. And those two things are connected because you're going to pay a great price for this freedom. So either you pay by the penny or by the pound. Either you pay 1 penny here and 1 penny there and 1 penny there throughout your day with moral actions, virtuous actions, or if you don't do that, eventually that price is going to come at a great cost all of a sudden. And that great cost, of course, would be a violent conflict in order to defeat tyranny. But here's the thing. Here's why that World War II vet says to himself that our freedom, our liberties in today's day and age are in a worse condition than they were in the 1940s when he was fighting for them in World War II. It's because nobody wants to pay for their freedom anymore. Quite honestly, as a student of history, I would say since World War II, all that America has done is to say to its people, okay, we'll exempt you from that moral, virtuous payment every day. We will depend upon the large payment of conflict, but we will simply outsource that conflict to other parts of the world so that you never see it. And by extension, many of you never have to pay anything for it. You get someone else to pay that price for you. And quite honestly, with the international spirit, and I say that more with disdain than praise, that we see around us in the last 50 years plus the internet becoming a thing and everybody being able to look into the countries of everyone else, most of the world have begun to have the opinion that, I'm sorry, America, but take your own war and fight it yourself. We're done. I honestly think that this whole Ukraine thing will probably be the last, if not one of the last, conflicts that we have outsourced to the rest of the world. And when that loophole has been closed, and it's beginning to tighten as we speak, and you come back to the normal, everyday American and say, okay, you're going to have to pay the price again, they simply do not want to pay that price. If you ask them to fight in a violent conflict, they will say no. And funny enough, if you ask them to be good, moral, virtuous people in order to pay for their freedoms, they will also say no. And here's where I think really is the nub of the entire problem. It's the fact that moral virtue is indeed a virtue, as I'm always talking about. It is something that has developed along with Western civilization for millennia. The idea that there are a certain fixed number of virtues in a fixed pattern. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And even before you get to virtue, first you have to have right reason. That is to say, your reason in accord with reality. And once you have your reason in accord with reality, then you can move on to those virtues, which are certain interactions within yourself, with other people, and with the society around you, in order for you to act in accord with what is real and what is true. This is why Aristotle would say things like, make yourself a friend of the truth. How do you do that? You do that by being virtuous. But virtue is a habit, and that habit, although it can be internal, as I said, it is relationship with yourself, with those around you, and with the greater whole of society around you. So to a great extent, it includes acting. You have to act in order to develop the habit of virtue. And one of the other ways of looking at virtue is that it is the power to accomplish one's ends. And when it says one's ends, it means what you are set up for by your nature as a human being to try and fulfill, to feel fulfilled. And if you tie that entire thing together and tie it to the original origin point of truth, you see that you not only have to act in order to be virtuous, but you have to take responsibility for those actions. That's part and parcel of what virtue does. It allows you to develop your conscience, which is to say, a re-examination. That's what the word actually means in its original. It is a re-examination of what you have done to see whether or not it actually plays out correctly according to reality, and if not, you rectify the situation and your actions according to virtue, according to truth, so that next time you do it, you will do it correctly. The short form of that is to say, you take responsibility for your actions. But in today's day and age, responsibility is a dirty word. And there are some very specific strains of this quote-unquote progressive mindset that we see everywhere around us today that are built specifically in order to exempt you or try and exempt you from responsibility for your own actions. If we look at feminism, and I'm not going to get into the argument of whether or not this is an actual female trait and they're just extending it, or whether or not they have inbuilt this into their ideological idea of feminism. But the idea within feminism is basically women shouldn't have responsibility for their own actions. It's someone else's problem. It's men's problem that women have it tough, that they have to pay for anything. And this is borne out, by the way, by the psychological studies in the last number of years. There's been a massive spike in psychological problems reported and self-reported psychological problems since 2020. Gee, I wonder why. And this has been greatly pronounced in women, gravitating specifically towards unhealthy mindsets wherein they simply do not take responsibility for their own actions or even their own emotions. I covered a ridiculous example of this on my channel a couple of years ago when I reviewed that idiotic She-Hulk show. And you had the producer going on and saying, yes, She-Hulk is acting out of rage in this show, but her rage is justified because of the patriarchy. Now let's look at something more grounded. Look at the election of the new mayor of New York over the last week or so. Mandami and his acceptance speech where he basically declares he's a socialist. I would say socialist/communist. And what is the backbone of that ideology? Well, the backbone is the idea of oppressor and oppressed. To say, well, you see, we have all these problems, but they're not our fault. They're the fault of the people who are oppressing us. I.e., I exempt myself from the responsibility for what my actions are doing. And I would say this extends to most of the left. Again, I would say that political thought on the right should be based upon the idea if that I see a problem occurs to me, who do I point the finger at? I point it at myself and say, how did I contribute to this problem and how do I rectify my actions in order to try and rectify the problem? Wherein the basic mindset of the left is something is wrong here, it's not our fault, it's your fault, and point the finger at someone else. Which again is the basic concept of I'm not taking responsibility for my own actions. Let's take another tack at examining this problem. We not only have the problem right now in North America of unfettered mass illegal immigration, but also the problem of, as we've seen over the last week, importing a lot of people into the country, supposedly to do jobs that we can't do in North America, but importing them from places where they simply don't have any sense of civic responsibility. I think the most in-your-face example of this would be taking in people, massive amounts of people from India and Pakistan. Now, I know some Indian immigrants myself. The ones I know are hardworking people and are, to some extent, civic-minded. They don't understand the entire premise of a lot of things going on here, but at the very least, they are somewhat civic-minded. But that's because the people that I know, which are Indian immigrants, have mostly accepted Western civilization standards long before they got here. Most notably because they have been Christian for at least 1 or 2 generations. But if you look at areas like India and Pakistan itself, you'll see a profound lack of any kind of civic responsibility. That's why there are mountains of trash everywhere. That's why people crap on the street on a regular daily basis. And if you want to push back on that, do the simple game, which people have been doing for years now, in that you go to Google Maps and drop yourself to a street view in anywhere in India, look around 360 degrees, and you will inevitably find garbage strewn all over the place somewhere. Or the simple fact that UNICEF for the last minimum 20 years has been trying to decrease birth defects in India, which are occurring because people are crapping in the streets so much. And they've been trying to teach them and say, you do have toilets, go use them, please. And they still don't. And it's not poverty that is causing this. Because again, we take large numbers of these people and import them into, well, let's just say English-speaking countries, and we see the exact same thing. We see these people being imported into Great Britain, and all of a sudden, mounds of trash start appearing places. They start doing things like taking their trash and dumping it in their neighbors' yards. Why? Because it's not their responsibility anymore. And they could just put it in the bin in front of their house and have it hauled away. But they don't do that. Or the other example of the fact that in central Canada over this last summer, they had to close down many beaches. Why? Because they're importing a lot of people from that part of the world, and all of a sudden, they got massive amounts of people crapping on the beaches. And they have access to state-of-the-art toilets, I'm sure not 20, 50 feet away, and yet they still don't use these facilities. Why? Because they have no sense of civic responsibility. You see, here was one of the things that I was thinking about when I did last week's video talking about the left as being basically a new form of the Christian heresy of Gnosticism. It's the fact that the basis of Western civilization, and especially a country like America, is Christian values, or at the very least, an extension of Christian values or an extension of values that existed before Christianity and then went straight into Christianity, like the idea of the virtues. America would not look the same if it did not have the idea of unalienable rights. And that idea of not just unalienable rights, but rights themselves comes straight out of the Middle Ages when you have Christian theologians pondering the rights of God and how man relates to that. And this is so much so that the main opponent within the West to those Christian ideas, that opponent being various forms of the left, they're not new ideas in themselves. They're simply either flipping the script of the Christian idea or complete opposition to the Christian idea. But 6 of one, half dozen of another, they wouldn't exist without the Christian idea to kick against. And so that idea of civic responsibility is based upon a mindset, whether you like it or hate it, no matter whether you're on the right or the left, of responsibility that draws itself back into the moral virtue as expressed through Christian ideals and those ideals that preceded Christianity that it subsumed. And you want to take in massive amounts of people who have no concept of this whatsoever? None. Because if you're going to do that, I don't care how much they can fill job positions or generate wealth through those job positions. They're not going to be a net positive for the culture. And quite honestly, I think we need to go back and look at the original form of, let's say, America. We're talking about America then. The original form of how America was created. And don't look back at it as in a progressive mindset and say, oh, we've progressed so much since then. No, look back at it and see why some of the restrictions were placed there to begin with. Think of it in terms of the fallacy of Chesterton's post, which is to say someone finds a post in the middle of the street and they say, let's tear this down. I don't know what it's for, therefore tear it down. The reply should be, no, you can't tear it down because you don't know what it's for. You first need to find out what it is for, and if it is indeed useless, then tear it down. But the point is that, let's just say, looking at the extension of the franchise for people to vote, most people just look back and say, yeah, there was this thing in the way and we just tore it down. Why? Because it didn't need to be there. Don't think of it in those terms. Think of it in the terms of, why was it there to begin with? Was there a positive reason why it was there to begin with? And if so, can we continue on that positive reason, perhaps in a different form, but at the very least continue it on? Or at the very least, start asking the question why it was there to begin with. Again, looking at the extension of the vote. First of all, women couldn't vote. Ask yourself why. Now, I'm not saying take it away from them now, but I'm saying look back and see why that condition was there. Was it possibly because they didn't have the same sense of responsibility for their own actions? I think it might have been. Let's look at the requirement, which was there in most states, of you have to be a landowner in order to vote. Was there a reason for that? Maybe it was because being a landowner means that you took serious your civic responsibilities, because if you didn't, you lost something personal to you. Let's look at the fact that still today, the president can't be foreign born and say, is there a reason for that? Should there be a reason to extend that to other forms of government elected positions? Is the reason for that because the person who should be in charge of things that have to do with the government understand what civic responsibility is, and they understand it because they have been here, because they are naturalized? And oh, by the way, we know now from research that at the very least in today's day and age, it takes about 3 generations for a family to be here before they truly become naturalized into the society. And I'm not saying all this because I wish to bring us back to some fantasy time where everything worked correctly, not because I'm an Istrophobe of this form or that. It's because we need to look at the way that our country actually is supposed to work correctly. And we have to look at it in terms of what you yourself can lose, because you can lose your liberty, your freedom, pretty damn quick if you never pay for it. But again, if you can't take responsibility for your own actions, you can't actually practice virtue. You can't practice virtue. You can't practice moral virtue or civic responsibility. And if you're not willing to do that, and on top of that, you're not willing to take responsibility to fight the good fight should the ultimate test of violent conflict emerge onto the scene, then guess what? Your liberty is gone. Your freedom is gone. And we have to start asking these questions because I'm looking around at a lot of the people around me and I think they would rather live in a gilded cage, wherein they don't have to take responsibility for themselves, but at the same time, they're willing to give up their freedom so they don't have to take responsibility for themselves. But I am not one of those people. And I think each one of us needs to take a long, hard look at ourselves and ask whether or not we would rather be comfortable or free. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.